Welcome to Basically MTG. I'm your host, Bad Kitty, and today I'll be joined by Reptile and Synergistic to talk about, well, basically MTG. Don't forget to follow us on our socials to keep up with what we are doing and brewing here on the channel. All links are in the description down below. In today's episode, we will be trying to answer the heavily debated topic of proxies. Are they a net positive or a net negative? So, Reptile, what's your stance on proxies? Are they a net positive or a net negative for the health of the game?
I think proxies are overall a net positive. I think the only time they're really a net negative is if it doesn't gel well with your play group, or
Okay.
if you're trying to sell the proxies off as real cards for any kind of like trades or monetary value, because then you're just lying to people and counterfeiting. So I think
Yeah.
for gameplay purposes, yes, proxies are overall a net positive, and it allows newer players to experience other aspects of the game before they make a huge investment. So, what about you, Synergistic?
Yeah, I'm in the sort of same boat as you. It's also important to note that last November, 2022, Wizards printed proxies officially for $1,000, a pack of them or whatever. So technically, I guess that's their stance on proxies. If you pay enough, you can play them or you use them to an extent. But I think generally, I'm in the same boat as you, where if you sell proxies to make money to counterfeit cards, you're a giant piece of shit. Sorry.
I think we got past the minute. We're good.
Yeah, I think I've definitely seen people counterfeit modern cards or legacy cards or even some EDH cards in the past. And there was a time that they were actually really good counterfeits. And it sucks a lot when somebody doesn't know how to check for a counterfeit and they get a counterfeit card. So yeah, that one I disagree with. I think those kind of proxies should really have make it really obvious, because I know at Reptile you have a handful of proxies that are duels that that look somewhat real, right? You mean the back?
Oh, yes, yeah. They're, at least with my proxies, there's I got them from. I guess I'm not gonna put the site on. It's a good site if you want to get proxies, but since we're talking about it in this light, I don't want to tell them about it. But yeah, the proxies that I got look exactly. It's really, really hard to tell them apart from the original ones. The only reason I didn't make any alterations was just because I know I don't have that kind of money, and this has to be fake. And also the condition, they come in perfect mint condition, so raising the price up even more. If anyone ever asks me, and I have been asked at the EDH tournaments, is that real? I always just tell them no, it's a proxy. Don't.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to note that there are sites out there that will refuse to sell you the original backing. In fact, they will actually offer you to upload your own backing, but they will not use the Wizards of the Coast backing to put on your proxies. Therefore, they are impossible to sell off as real, because they are extremely well done. A lot of the technology used for printing is widely available, and it's not that hard to kind of really do that as a business. So it's really appreciative when there's self-aware proxy companies out there being okay, we're gonna curb some of the bad name for this, because like you were just speaking on, I don't have that money for duels. And plus, a little bit of a controversial, I don't know if it's controversial, but I think the dual arts are ugly. And so having those proxies, my proxies specifically, are extremely custom. So they look totally different than anything of what a normal proxy would be. And I think that's a little bit fun for cards that usually would not be accessible to casual players or even people who are collectors, because it's just a nice card to have. But yeah, my whole point is they're becoming more self-aware of the fact that people are trying to hawk these on the internet as real cards, and it's a huge issue within the community.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's something that ultimately comes down to just the responsibility of the player and not going. You can take the extra step, and then, like you said, there are certain sites that will alter it so that it is distinguishable. But for mine, the ones that I have, yeah, if someone's really, and people usually are going to know what to look out for, especially when you're purchasing cards of that high value. You're not just going to come across a random person who doesn't really know too much about the game. So it really just comes down on you to not be a dick and try to scam someone out of hundreds of dollars or a bunch of cards because they want to trade for a duel, things like that.
Yeah, there's also a bunch of videos that can tell you and teach you how to check back of cards or like all cards to make sure they're real. So I'm sure there's a lot of resources you can do to check. Another thing that I think about proxies, so generally, aside from that negative aspect of it, I think proxies are fine as long as you're responsible with it. And you also like ask people that you're playing with to make sure they're okay with it. Because I think, again, anecdotes here, but we've played in the past where people would just show up with a full proxy deck, and this is before we started CEDH. So this was during the arms race where people just like out of nowhere proxy a full CEDH deck.
Oh yeah, I remember Slivers back in the day destroyed us once.
Yeah, and
Color Slivers, yeah.
no one ever asked me if I was comfortable with that, and that was again part with the Rule Zero conversation where that never happened. But like, I never signed up for like that kind of game where I would just get wrecked because it's your deck doesn't have to be super expensive to be very good. Like Jericho's an example of it, but there are cards that make it more efficient, right? So when people have like tutors and fast mana, that will make your deck more efficient. Especially if you're playing with lower power decks, it's gonna be like day and night almost. So kind of proxying responsibly is a thing for me. Now that, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna ask you both a question. So when you're proxying responsibly, when we're talking about proxies, is the card that's proxied factored in to whether or not it's an okay card? Or is it just cards in general? Because I think there's a difference between proxying, like a Thieves Guild Enforcer, and it's just the first one that came up, and a Mana Crypt.
So I think what Synergistic is more referencing when proxying responsibly is the tutors, the fetch lands, the fast mana, the things where it will entirely change a casual pod into a higher level pod because the decks become more efficient. If you're printing things like the example you just gave, or like tap lands and things like that, that's not really going to change the speed of the game. That's just allowing you access to cards that you don't currently own. But if you go to a pre-con group and you sit down with all of the fast mana printed, that's not very responsible of you because you are going to slosh them, or at least have a good chance of sloshing them.
Yeah, so like, to recap, would I be okay if somebody proxied a bunch of 10-cent cards? As of right now, I generally do not care if people proxy their decks. I am past the point of caring. I think for myself, I don't proxy cards. Just if I don't have a card, I don't use it. That's just because of how the game's supposed to be played, in the sense of like it's a collectible trading card game. But I generally don't care if like people proxied a Mana Crypt, a tutor. I think it allows people to like play with a card before they spend hundreds of dollars on it, right? Because a lot of cards are really expensive, especially like a Green Monolith or Mana Vault or Imperial Seal, Force of Will, etc., right? Really expensive cards. It allows people to like have a chance to use them, and and that's okay. They should at least get to play with the card first before buying it, right? Test drive your Ferrari before you purchase it.
Agreed. And it's kind of crazy. I think Sol Ring is an odd example, because if Sol Ring wasn't as heavily printed and almost like a staple of Commander as it is, it'd probably be up there in terms of Mana Crypt prices, for being honest.
For sure.
So
it's
just
such a
to
heavy
see
staple.
that, yeah, and the fact that they implemented it as a Commander staple, I don't think anyone's ever like upset. Maybe I think more people are upset in lower powered games when you use Sol Ring rather than if you just proxied one because you forgot it. They're like, oh, okay, we know you got one. We know you have to have a Sol Ring, so let's go ahead, proxy it. Who cares?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. A question for both of you, since we've all had a little bit of experience in this now with going to our local tournaments. What is your opinions on allowing proxies within tournaments? How do you feel about that? Is it a net negative, net positive? Where are you landing now that we've, spent a lot of time in that realm where proxies are allowed at our current local tournament?
I think overall, for our local tournament, it is, I think on a local level, it is great because on a national, like when you start talking about the nationals and maybe like even international competitions, I think it almost goes back to what Synergistic said, where it's a showcase of the entirety of the trading card game, and part of
Mhm.
that is what cards do you own and what cards you're going to be able to bring and compete with. So I think at that, it kind of dips off at a certain level. At a local level, things that are happening every week, I actually think it's super beneficial, and I'm glad that our scene is doing it because you're able to play against the metagame that you're more likely going to see at a national or international level when people are taking this super seriously and they've invested $10,000 in their deck and they're going
Mhm.
and trying to win. It's good to get the practice against that. Otherwise, I think it kind of skews your metagame a little bit because now, I think one thing was before they reprinted Imperial Seal, like it didn't have like $900 to spend on an Imperial Seal. So it's a great card, but you're not going to see it outside of the people who are really going in. But now we can, and I can play around it. I have experience with it. I really like it. I think it falls off after a certain point. But what do you think, Synergistic?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's also like a net positive because, like I said, you're able to like test a card on a week to week time frame, so it allows people to try different decks and different cards. Obviously, like there is a limit to what you can proxy at our local game store. Like you can't just show with the whole proxy deck. I think it's like a lot of the high end cards, such as like I said, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, all the duels, etc., etc. So it does allow people to try a lot of different cards, which is again a net positive, I think. I'm kind of curious what the meta was before the allowed proxies, because there was a point where they didn't allow proxies. So I'm kind of wondering what that would look like, right? What the scene looked like back then.
I believe we were looking into it, and we saw an Azusa deck win the mono green extra 2 lands before we actually went to a tournament. I remember that was one thing we were just like, oh, Azusa won. What's going on here?
If I remember correctly, I did have a conversation with the judge that runs the tournament, and he did say that a huge basis for the decision to allow a proxy list is that there are players that were participating within the tournament that were having a severe advantage because they owned a lot of those cards because they have been a long-time collector, or they got lucky on trades and stuff like that. And so his idea was to kind of level the playing field a little bit to allow players the chance to play those cards that are usually unobtainable.
Yeah. So, playing devil's advocate, right? Is it a big FU to someone who owns a card to allow somebody else to, because at the end of the day, right? Magic the Gathering is a tradable card game, a collectible trading card game. It's literally what if you search up in Wikipedia or whatever, that's literally what Magic the Gathering is, right? The intent of Magic the Gathering is you're supposed to grind, play, trade up until you're able to achieve this, rare mythical card, right? Obviously there's life happens, economy happens, cards are extremely expensive, you have to play it and grind a bunch before you can get them, but still that's kind of in the nature of the game. So we're kind of skipping a couple steps just for ease of just allowing other people to play and participate, and obviously that's kind of the opposite view, right? This is the opposed to Proxies views. What do you guys think about that?
I think that it, in a sense, I don't think it completely diminishes the cards that the collectors have. I think it again circles back to I can see your argument, though. I will agree that part of a connection that you feel to the deck that you're playing is because you have the cards and you're able to build around it, and maybe you traded a couple from a deck that you would have had, but instead you don't have it because you traded a couple cards over to get this one card that was crucial. I think it brings a certain element to it, but in tournament settings, I think, especially for what our locals are, I think this completely applies to the highest level because it just, it's sponsored by Wizards. It's their own tournaments usually that they're putting back. But at a local level, I think it's good just for the reasons that we stated before, for the exposure and just for the practice that you would get. So I think in a tournament setting, you're not actively trading or doing anything. It's more of the game action itself. And I don't think that, if anything, you never come out at an advantage. It's always just a net neutral because they have the same options and tools as you.
So to kind of answer your question, I agree with Reptile in terms of like in tournaments and stuff like that. But your not analogy, but your kind of the whole theory here is that allowing people to print those cards is a big FU to players who own those cards, and that the whole goal is to trade up, correct?
That is, yeah, how a collectible trading card game usually works. Yes.
Okay. That would be very applicable and the ideal goal if we weren't talking about cards that the lowest price card that's allowed to be proxied is $150. And like we're talking like average cards that are being released in sets now, like I think the most expensive one in like the recent set was like $60. So now you're having to trade 5 or 6 of your best cards that you have a very low chance of pulling in the first place unless you buy as singles, to then try and get a singular $150 card that is in a 100 card deck. I mean, speaking of Commander specifically, not even to talk on like, you know, constructed formats where you need 4 cards. So like if the market for, you know, singles and things like that were a little better for people to be able to trade into, I can definitely see that as being the argument, because then there's no reason why you can't. There's enough cards, there's enough sealed that's being open for people to have like a good economy of trading. The problem is that when cards aren't printed enough, or cards are put on a special little list to not be allowed to be printed, that's when those prices of those cards go to points where the average Joe can't afford them. So therefore, it's literally a pay to win game, because we're not talking about cards that are $500 because it's rare, but it's a bad card. We're talking about cards that are $500 and a game-changing card. So like, I think there's a big world of difference when comparing and contrasting the two situations.
Sure. No, yeah. I mean, like I said, I see both sides, right? I think you know, it's wrong to just dismiss people's feelings on the topic, because it is like, you know, you can ask a lot of different people and they can have, you know, most people are usually proxy friendly, but there's people that would also like, you know, oppose proxies. And I will admit, you know, I used to like fully oppose proxies because for the reasons I said, I feel like people were just like being extremely responsible with them, and we were at different power levels, and that was just a very unfun time, right? When someone like looks at me and tells me, hey, I proxied this deck just to counter your deck, I consider that a big FU. So that did happen. Sure. So
I remember that.
So I get that. You know, back when I was, you know, in college and whatnot, I used to go to my FNM to play Modern, and I didn't spend any money on Magic. I was borrowing somebody's deck. I was actually borrowing one of Dr. Blusky's decks for Modern. It was really bad. I lost all the time. But even if you place at tournaments, you like sometimes you can make money, right? And that's like every week you make a little bit more money at store credit and whatever. At a point, you'll make enough money to buy a good card, and then it's like a grind kind of thing, right? Where you're like slowly but surely building your deck up and like getting more cards, and like, you know, because you're winning a little more every so often. But so it's like a long process which requires you to, you know, play a lot. But that's also like one of the ways where I presume it was like done in the past, where people would just like, you know, play more, win, get store credit, make new deck, trade up or whatever, right?
Oh,
so
yeah,
almost
absolutely.
like a snowball effect.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's you slowly accrue a collection that you can then kind of really get whatever you want. The more you play, the more you earn, and the more you have. So that's a good point.
And kind of going back to our local game store, I think if you were to win the tournament, like first place or like, you know, top 8 or whatever, if you get first place, you're getting like anywhere from like $50 to $150, right? And in the top end, that's almost a mana creep, right? So
yeah,
you just kind of grind out like a really cost-effective deck where you can just win often. So like, you know, Jericho or whatever, that's, you know, they don't have to be super expensive. They can, you know, a somewhat budgeted version can sometimes outperform really expensive decks.
Yes.
So I don't. Again, like I said, I'm full pro proxies, but those are just kind of like thoughts and things
At
people would
least when
argue.
it comes to this and our local tournaments, the fact that proxies are allowed for everyone while also still having, we always just get in-store credit, usually like $50 to $100. It almost allows the people who do not have access to those a way to get access to those outside of if financially they're unable to afford it. And I think that aspect of it is actually pretty good. I understand that, you lose out the edge of being a collector and having some of the rarest cards and some of the most powerful cards. But in the tournament setting, a lot of it is focused. It has its own rule set. Like we have time. There's certain things that already warp it in a certain way. So I think just giving the even playing field and allowing not the snowball effect like we talked about before, where if you have the highest cards, if you have the most powerful and expensive cards, you have a higher chance of winning and of getting the most money, which in turn lets you get the most powerful and expensive cards. This almost allows you to play with them, and if you do well with them and you apply them well, you can actually get them. So I like that aspect of it.
Yeah, it kind of cuts the middleman out of trading and allows you to, if you succeed within the tournament, you succeed within like collecting your cards. So yeah, it's a nice little setup that our local thing has going on.
Yeah, and this isn't only like EDH, right? I think I've played in a couple legacy tournaments as well. They usually allowed you like somewhere between like 15 to 20 proxies. I haven't seen it for modern or standard. And I think sometimes modern can be extremely expensive format to play. And in the past, standard has also been extremely expensive. So this is only like a conversation for kind of EDH, presumably vintage, and legacy.
I think it's just a conversation for anything that involves the reserve list, because you can make the argument that if you allow proxies in modern, those cards will be in circulation and reprinted maybe somewhere down the line, as opposed to the formats you mentioned, which have reserve list cards that are almost legally obliged to not be reprinted.
Right.
So I believe it's just, I think they did that not based on price, but more so on scarcity, because there's a set limited amount that there only could be of these, and then some get destroyed, so there's even less than what you printed before. And if your community grows, you can't exactly stunt them because there's physically not enough cards. I think the reserve list plays a huge factor into that, and that's why we don't see it in other formats like modern. Pioneer's not too expensive, but modern for the most part, where it can get pretty expensive, upwards of like 1,200 a deck.
Right.
So overall, what do you guys think? Are we thinking that proxies are a net positive, a net negative? How are we falling on this?
I'm still leaning towards the overall net positive, but I am aware that the negatives can be very negative in terms of getting blown out on a trade because you have a fake card and you just traded away a bunch of value. And the experience that someone who is a collector and goes through it, not being able to have that innate edge that usually comes with a proxy or a non-proxy tournament, because you have access to like 4 copies of, go back to modern like Ragavan, 4 copies of Ragavan as opposed to 2, something like that. So yeah, I think overall just be responsible with them and don't fake them, and overall pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, take home messages: don't be a dick. Don't be like selling cards that aren't real. Be responsible with your play group, and honestly, do ask your group if they're comfortable with proxies. Don't just assume that they're okay with it. More often than not, people will be okay with it, but it doesn't really hurt to ask. It's also part of the rules of your conversation as well. So I think I'm in the same boat as Reptile. I think it's a net positive. There are some negatives that we can like ignore because it's not fantasy land, but overall, I think it's a net positive as well.
Okay.
What about you, Bad Kitty? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with all sides here. I can see the negatives, but overall, for just the casual health of the game, because again, when you speak on the competitive levels, I really feel like a giant part of the community is being left out of consideration there. We just happen to be very focused on the competitive aspect of a lot of the game because that's where we find most of the fun is to see how fast we can go and how well our decks can perform. But in speaking with the community, I find a lot of the times that the community doesn't really want to go much stronger than an upgraded precon. Like they really enjoy the hour to hour and a half games, the turn 12, turn 13s, because they get to see wild and crazy shit happen. So, you know, Proxies in that kind of state where, you know, you're playing with basically upgraded precons, you like you said, don't be a dick. You're okay to proxy cards if you can't afford to buy the $20 staple that would help upgrade your thing, but at the same time, don't go and bling out your deck and get all of the, you know, tutors and fetches and free spells and fast mana, and then come to your play group thinking that everybody's going to be real happy when you start winning turn 2, turn 3. Yeah, the biggest message is talk to fucking people, really just communicate and see what their feelings are on it. It's a great thing to use for testing out decks. It's a great thing to do if you just want to be a part of the community, but you don't want that heavy investment because, to be honest, Magic is a little, it's not a little much, it's a lot of the time. And so getting into the investment, you have to be really dedicated to put a lot of your money towards it. So having proxies is, I think, what opens up our community and makes it a better, healthier game in terms of like casual play. Where you get concerned when money's involved, that's a bigger, more intricate conversation. But as long as you're not selling your proxies, you're being pretty good about what you proxy. Fuck it, why not? You know, really, who are you hurting except for like maybe the healthier play group if you're not considerate. So those are my thoughts on the entire thing. But yeah,
Conversation overall on proxies, like I'm pretty sure, you know, people have said this before, but overall it's good to get an overall like perspective on the community, because it can tear some play groups apart. I've seen it before.
Yeah.
So.
Almost 2 hours apart, so
Definitely.
definitely you provided a lot of unnecessary drama. Absolutely. Cool. If you're still listening to us, thank you, and you know, don't forget to come check out our other videos and see what we're playing and brewing. We're hoping to do a lot more spell table games, so don't forget to, you know, check out our Discord or join our Discord if you haven't, and don't forget to drop a comment or a like.
Yeah, plug in all the social media, all that shit. Yeah, if you want to play with us, just click the links, tell us, we'll be down.
Awesome. Thanks everybody. Stay basic. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah, keep it basic.